It all started unexpectedly, as if fate had set up that moment to catch me off guard. I'm Daniel, and this is the story of how everything changed for me in a way I could never have predicted. I was 18, living an ordinary life, until something completely new exploded into my world, making my heart race and my body respond in ways I never imagined. Our house had been destroyed by a flood. I lost everything. My life, my memories, every familiar corner. With the destruction, my dad and I were left without a place to go. Luckily, Darren, an old friend of my dad's, offered us his place until things settled down. I barely knew Darren, but I always remembered him as an impressive man, the kind you can't ignore, and I knew he lived alone in a luxury apartment. When we arrived, it felt like a punch of reality. The apartment was absurdly modern, with huge glass windows, expensive furniture, and an air of sophistication that seemed to belong to another world. As soon as Darren opened the door, with that wide, welcoming smile, I felt my heart race. He was a man who couldn't be ignored. Tall, strong, with broad shoulders and arms that clearly showed the hours he spent at the gym. And to complicate everything even more, Darren was openly gay. The first shock came that very night. I was in my room, trying to settle in, when Darren knocked on the door and entered without warning. He wore only a pair of low-slung pajama pants, just enough to showcase that muscular, perfect body that I couldn't stop admiring. That moment left me completely vulnerable. The way he looked at me, how his eyes roamed over my body, was undeniable. I was starting to feel something I had never allowed to surface, a desire, a raw, undeniable attraction. During the first few days, Darren was incredibly attentive, always making sure I was comfortable. But there was something more, something unspoken in every little touch, in every glance we exchanged. I could feel his gaze burning on me when he casually placed a hand on my shoulder, or ran his fingers through my hair in a way that seemed too innocent to be truly innocent. And then, the morning my dad left for a business trip, leaving just me and Darren alone in the apartment, everything changed. I got up early, still half asleep, and headed to the bathroom. The hallway was quiet, and my mind was on autopilot. But when I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Darren was there, completely naked, his skin still wet and glistening under the soft bathroom light. The steam was still swirling around him, like a kind of aura that made him seem almost unreal. My God, I couldn't stop staring. Every muscle, every curve of his sculpted body looked like something straight out of my wildest dreams. He was perfect, more than I could have imagined. And even though I knew I shouldn't, my eyes couldn't tear away. The shock held me frozen for a few seconds until reality hit. And embarrassed, I took a step back. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here," I stammered, quickly shutting the door. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, embarrassment, excitement, and something I couldn't even identify. I rushed back to my room, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I had just seen Darren, the man I was starting to develop dangerous feelings for, completely naked, and the worst part, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Minutes later, I heard the bathroom door open. My body tensed. The air seemed heavy. Darren was coming, and I knew this moment would change everything. He entered the room with that same smile, a towel loosely wrapped around his hips. His gaze met mine, and the way he looked at me made my skin tingle. "You don't need to be embarrassed, Daniel," he said, his voice soft and full of intention. He stepped closer, and I could feel the tension rising with each passing second. My heart was racing, and all I wanted was to give in. I wanted to feel his touch. I wanted him to make all those fantasies I had been having become real. His presence was overwhelming, intoxicating. He got closer, until he was standing right in front of me, his hand resting on my shoulder, the warmth of his fingers burning my skin. "I know what you're feeling," he whispered, his eyes dark with desire. My body responded instantly. I knew what he wanted, and more than that, I knew I wanted it too. I wanted this. I wanted Darren. Without another word, Darren leaned in, his fingers trailing down my chest. My whole body trembled at his touch. I was completely at his mercy, for everything he represented: desire, seduction, and the freedom I had never allowed myself to feel. The days that followed that first spark of tension between Daniel and Darren were a dangerous game of stolen glances, subtle touches, and undeniable chemistry that neither could hide anymore. Most of the time, they were alone. Daniel's father, always busy with work, seemed emotionally distant after the flood, leaving Daniel and Darren with a dangerous amount of freedom inside the apartment. Every small gesture carried weight, an unspoken desire in every glance exchanged. Daniel could feel it, a burning energy between them, something he had never experienced before. During the first few weeks, Daniel tried to convince himself he was reading too much into his interactions with Darren. He tried to distract himself, focus on other things, but his mind always circled back to the same image: Darren's naked body, glistening under the soft bathroom light. The way he had looked at Daniel that day, with a mix of understanding and temptation, was seared into his mind like a fire he couldn't extinguish. And then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel's father had left for another business trip, leaving the two of them alone once again. That afternoon, the tension in the apartment was thick, almost suffocating, and Daniel could feel something was about to happen. Darren suggested they watch a movie on the living room couch, something that seemed innocent enough, but Daniel knew there was nothing innocent about the invitation. He sat next to Darren, the space between them minimal. The air was heavy with anticipation. The movie barely registered in his mind, because all he could think about was Darren sitting so close, his presence overwhelming, making Daniel's heart race with every breath. Suddenly, Darren made a move that couldn't be ignored. He placed his hand gently on Daniel's knee, his fingers slowly sliding up his leg, caressing his skin over the fabric of his pants. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart racing. The desire he had been repressing for days was about to explode. He looked at Darren. Their eyes met, and deep down, he knew there was no turning back. "Are you nervous?" Darren asked, his voice low and rough, filled with a promise that made Daniel's body respond instantly. He didn't need to answer. Darren already knew. Without breaking eye contact, Darren's hand slid up to the back of Daniel's neck, pulling him in for a kiss. But it wasn't just any kiss, it was intense. A shock of electricity coursing through Daniel's body. He couldn't stop the moan that escaped his throat, completely surrendering to the moment. Darren didn't hesitate. His lips and tongue explored with expertise, making Daniel lose control. Darren, still kissing him, began to unbutton Daniel's shirt, each button opening up more space for his hands to explore the warmth of his bare chest. Daniel gasped when Darren's fingers touched his skin, tracing lines of fire down his abdomen. The touch was firm, deliberate, and every caress made Daniel lose more of himself in the moment, sinking deeper into the desire he had tried to suppress. "Let's get rid of this," Darren murmured against Daniel's lips, as he pulled off his shirt, revealing his slender, heated body. Daniel helped remove the rest of his clothes, the fabric falling to the floor like it no longer mattered. Because right now, the only thing that mattered was Darren's touch. Every second seemed to heighten the need, the heat rising between them like an uncontrollable wave. Darren didn't stop there. He stood up for a moment, pulling off his own shirt in one swift motion, revealing his sculpted body, every muscle perfectly defined, like a living statue. Daniel stared, the desire building to almost unbearable levels. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Darren, from that broad chest, those strong arms and the lines of his abdomen that left him breathless. Darren was everything he had always wanted, but never allowed himself to admit. Darren moved back, and when their bodies finally touched, skin against skin, Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline so intense his legs almost gave out. They kissed again, this time with more urgency. Darren's hands traveled down Daniel's back, pulling him closer, their bodies pressed together, breathing in sync, as if they were becoming one. "You're more beautiful than I imagined," Darren whispered in Daniel's ear, as his hands slid down to his waist, pulling him even closer. Daniel closed his eyes, completely lost in the sensation, his breath heavy, his body reacting to every touch, every word. It was like the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in that moment of pure connection and desire. Without waiting any longer, Darren unbuttoned Daniel's pants, slowly pulling them down, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin of his hips, sending shivers through every inch of his body. Daniel, breathless, didn't resist. He wanted this, wanted to feel every touch, every caress Darren had to offer. When his pants hit the floor, leaving him nearly naked, his body burned with anticipation. Darren looked at him, desire clear in his eyes. "You don't need to be afraid of anything, Daniel," he murmured, as his fingers traced a provocative path across Daniel's skin, moving up and down, exploring every curve. "I'm going to make you feel things you've never felt before." The promise in Darren's words sent Daniel's heart racing again. He knew this was only the beginning, that there was so much more to come, and when Darren's hands finally began to explore his body with more intensity, Daniel felt like he was falling into an abyss of pleasure he didn't want, or couldn't escape from. The night was just beginning, and Daniel knew his life would never be the same after this. The hours that followed that night felt timeless, a whirlwind of sensations and desires Daniel had never experienced before. Darren dominated him with every touch, every kiss, exploring his body with an intimacy that went far beyond the physical. For Daniel, it was as if something deep inside him had been unleashed, a need, a hunger he never knew existed, but now consumed everything. Darren was firm but gentle. He knew exactly how to guide every movement, how to provoke the reactions he wanted from Daniel's young, inexperienced body. Every caress, every whisper made Daniel fall deeper into that overwhelming feeling. He had never imagined he could feel this way, so exposed yet so desired. And Darren was there, always in control, holding the reins of that situation, with the confidence that made Daniel surrender completely. As their clothes fell to the floor, the atmosphere in the room felt thick with raw energy. The sound of Darren's heavy breathing mixed with the rapid beat of Daniel's heart, echoing in his ears like a drum. Their naked bodies finally came together, and the warmth of Darren's skin against his made Daniel feel vulnerable and powerful all at once. The bed creaked softly under their weight, and every movement seemed to increase the tension between them. Darren pulled Daniel closer, their bodies pressed tightly together, while his hands traced slow, provocative paths down Daniel's back, sliding to his hips, pulling him closer with more force. Darren's kiss was insatiable, his lips exploring every inch of Daniel's skin, and Daniel was on the verge of complete surrender, his mind entirely overtaken by the need for more. "You're amazing," Darren whispered into Daniel's ear, his lips barely grazing his skin. I've never felt something like this. Daniel could only nod, unable to form words. His breath was heavy, and his whole body seemed to be on fire. Every touch from Darren made his skin burn. Every word pierced deep, stirring something he couldn't even name. It was as if he were falling deeper and deeper into something much bigger than himself. Darren's hand slid down Daniel's body, exploring slowly, without rushing, every inch of skin at his disposal. And the more Darren touched him, the more Daniel lost himself in the moment. He felt his body responding automatically to every caress, every provocation. The sensation was almost overwhelming, but at the same time he wanted more. He needed more, and Darren knew exactly how to provoke that. He kissed Daniel's neck, following a path that made Daniel shudder until he reached his chest, where his lips and hands continued to explore, driving Daniel to a state of pure pleasure. With every moan, Darren seemed to intensify his movements, knowing exactly what to do to push Daniel to the edge. Daniel arched his back, feeling a wave of heat run down his spine as Darren moved lower, leaving a trail of kisses and touches that set every part of his body on fire. He could no longer hold back the moans escaping his lips, and the feeling of having Darren so close, so attentive to every reaction of his body, made him completely lose control. The world outside that room ceased to exist. It was just the two of them in that moment. When Darren climbed back up, their bodies colliding again, Daniel pulled him closer, feeling the need grow even stronger inside him. He wanted this, more than anything he had ever wanted before. Darren's strong, confident body pressed against his, in a way that made Daniel's heart race even faster. "I told you you'd enjoy it," Darren murmured, with a teasing smile as his hands explored further, his voice low and full of desire. He leaned over Daniel, their bodies so close they seemed to be melting together. Daniel couldn't think about anything except how good it felt, how the desire for Darren consumed him in ways he could never have predicted. The tension between them grew, each movement more urgent, more intense. Darren continued to provoke him, his touch, his kisses, all calculated to drive Daniel to the brink of madness. And when the explosion of pleasure finally came, it felt as though Daniel's entire world had shattered around him, leaving only the ecstasy of that moment. Breathless, the two collapsed onto the bed, their bodies still pressed together, their breathing heavy. Darren turned to the side, pulling Daniel close, his fingers still tracing small circles on Daniel's skin. And there, in that moment, with their bodies still pulsing with the energy of what had just happened, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. He knew that nothing would ever be the same, but, at the same time, a quiet doubt began to form in Daniel's mind. What did this mean? What were they doing? He was only 18, and Darren was his father's friend, much older, much more experienced. There was so much at stake, so many consequences he hadn't stopped to think about before letting himself get swept away by that moment. But as much as those doubts haunted him, Daniel knew he couldn't fight what he was feeling. The desire was too strong, too deep to ignore, and in that moment, he was willing to risk everything. Darren, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He smiled at Daniel, a smile that said more than any words could. He knew exactly what he was doing and had no intention of stopping there. "I told you not to be afraid," he whispered, his fingers still tracing the outline of Daniel's face. "This is just the beginning." Daniel's heart raced again. This is just the beginning. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but it was clear that moment had changed everything, and now there was no turning back. That night felt endless, the heat between Daniel and Darren nearly tangible. The room was wrapped in a soft glow, with only the moonlight seeping through the window, illuminating the contours of their bodies. The air was thick with desire, and every second that passed seemed to heighten the tension between them. Darren began to move slowly, deliberately, his hands exploring every inch of Daniel's skin, as if he wanted to memorize every detail. Daniel felt every touch like an electric charge, a shiver running down his spine as Darren's fingers traced the line of his waist, sliding gently down to his hips. He bit his lip, trying to hold back the moan that threatened to escape, but with every touch it became harder. "You like this, don't you?" Darren murmured in a teasing tone, his breath warm against Daniel's ear. He didn't need a verbal response. Daniel's body, completely surrendered, had already answered for him. Darren didn't stop. He moved lower, leaving a trail of wet kisses along Daniel's chest, going further down, teasing him with each passing second, every inch he covered. When his lips finally reached the soft skin of Daniel's abdomen, he felt the young man beneath him tremble, completely vulnerable to the pleasure Darren was giving him. Darren's fingers worked skillfully, undoing the last button of Daniel's pants, pulling them off slowly, as if savoring every moment. The cool air hitting Daniel's exposed skin made his body arch slightly, an involuntary invitation for Darren to continue, and Darren knew exactly what to do with that invitation. He leaned down, his hands firmly gripping Daniel's hips, as his lips traveled lower and lower, exploring with a mixture of desire and control. Every second, the tension in the air seemed to grow, every movement pushing Daniel closer to the edge. He was completely exposed, vulnerable, and that vulnerability only increased the pleasure he was feeling. Finally, when Darren's lips touched Daniel's most sensitive spots, he couldn't hold back the moan. The sound was rough, full of pleasure, and that only made Darren intensify his movements. With every touch, every tease, Daniel's body responded more intensely, his senses heightened by the pleasure he could barely process. Darren moved up and down with a precision that seemed rehearsed, his hands holding Daniel's hips firmly to keep him from escaping what was happening. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Darren moved back up, his lips once again exploring Daniel's chest until they met in a fiery kiss. As their mouths met, their hands didn't stop exploring. Darren pulled Daniel closer, their skin slick with sweat, the heat between them growing with each passing second. Their breaths were heavy, and Daniel felt like he was about to explode from so much desire. Every movement, Darren led him deeper, every touch making him want more. Daniel felt Darren's hands slide down his back, gripping his skin, pulling him closer with a force that made his body tremble. He could barely think, his mind clouded by pleasure, his body responding to every little movement Darren made. He was so close, his towel barely hanging onto his hips, his presence so overwhelming that Daniel felt like he might lose control. Darren turned him around and pushed him up against the wall, the sudden movement taking Daniel's breath away. Before he could even process what was happening, he felt Darren's hands on him, roaming over his body with an urgency that made his skin tingle. His fingers slipped under the waistband of Daniel's shorts, pulling them down in one quick motion, and Daniel gasped as the cool air hit his skin. He was completely exposed, vulnerable, and he loved every second of it. The feeling of Darren's hands on his bare skin, the way his fingers trailed down his spine, it was all too much. He could barely catch his breath, his heart hammering in his chest as he waited for what he knew was coming next. Darren didn't hesitate. He pressed himself against Daniel from behind, his chest flush against Daniel's back, his breath hot on Daniel's neck as he leaned in close. "You don't need to be shy," Darren whispered, his voice low and rough. "I know what you want." Daniel shivered at the sound of Darren's voice, his entire body reacting to his words. He was right. Daniel did want this. He wanted Darren more than he had ever wanted anything in his life, and the fact that Darren wanted him too made it all the more intoxicating. The tension between them grew with every second, every touch, until the room was filled with their moans, their heavy breathing, and the soft creaking of the bed as they moved together. Darren's hands never left Daniel's body, guiding him, teasing him, until the pleasure became too much to bear. When they finally reached the climax, it was like an explosion. Daniel couldn't hold back the sounds that came from his throat, his body trembling with the intensity of it all. Darren was with him, his own moans mingling with Daniel's as they reached the peak together, their bodies trembling with the force of their release. Breathless, they collapsed onto the bed, their bodies still intertwined, their skin slick with sweat as they tried to catch their breath. Darren turned to the side, pulling Daniel close to him, his fingers still tracing lazy circles on Daniel's skin. And in that moment, with their bodies still pulsing from what had just happened, Daniel knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But, as much as that moment was intense, a small shadow began to form in Daniel's mind. What did this mean? What were they doing? He was only 18, and Darren was his father's friend, much older, much more experienced. There was so much at stake, so many consequences he hadn't stopped to think about before letting himself get swept away by that moment. But as much as those doubts haunted him, Daniel knew he couldn't fight what he was feeling. The desire was too strong, too deep to ignore, and in that moment, he was willing to risk everything. The days that followed seemed like a blur of stolen moments, each one more intense than the last. Darren and Daniel were playing a dangerous game, and the thrill of secrecy only added to the heat between them. Each time Daniel's father left for business, the apartment became a playground for their desires. The tension between them was undeniable, and with every shared glance, every fleeting touch, it grew stronger. That afternoon, the air in the apartment was thick with anticipation. Daniel could feel it, the way Darren looked at him, the unspoken promise in his eyes. They had been alone for hours, and the energy between them was electric. Darren didn't waste any time. He pulled Daniel to him with a force that left no room for hesitation, his hands already unbuttoning Daniel's shirt, quickly revealing his bare chest. Daniel gasped, his body already responding to Darren's touch, the heat rising between them like a fire that couldn't be contained. "I've been waiting for this all day," Darren murmured against Daniel's neck, his hands sliding down Daniel's back, tracing a path that made every part of him come alive. Daniel could hardly respond. His breath was already ragged, and the heat in his body was spreading with every touch from Darren. Their clothes fell to the floor in a matter of seconds, and before he could even process what was happening, they were both naked, their bodies colliding with a force that made Daniel's heart race. Darren pushed him up against the bedroom wall, the impact making Daniel's heart pound even harder. His hands gripped Daniel's hips tightly, holding him in place as their mouths met in a wild, hungry kiss. The pressure of Darren's body against his made every fiber of Daniel's being scream for more, and he knew Darren was ready to give him everything. Darren's mouth moved down Daniel's chest, his lips hot as they trailed over his skin, leaving Daniel trembling beneath his touch. Every kiss, every lick, was like an explosion of sensations, Daniel's body reacting to every move Darren made. His moans filled the room, muffled by the sound of their bodies moving together. Darren turned Daniel around, his hands sliding over his shoulders and down his waist, gripping him firmly as he leaned in, pressing his body against Daniel's from behind. Daniel bit his lip, his body already burning with anticipation. He was completely exposed, vulnerable, and it only heightened the desire he felt coursing through him. "You're going to love this," Darren murmured into his ear, his voice rough with desire. He positioned himself behind Daniel, his hands gripping his hips tightly as he began to move, slowly at first, teasing him with each thrust. The pressure of Darren's body against his was almost unbearable, every movement sending shockwaves of pleasure through Daniel's entire being. He could hardly breathe, his muscles tensing as Darren picked up the pace, his hands never leaving Daniel's hips, controlling every movement. Daniel moaned, his body trembling with every thrust, his hands braced against the wall, as Darren drove him deeper into a world of pleasure he couldn't escape. Darren's rhythm was relentless, his hips slamming against Daniel's with a force that made him gasp for breath. It was all too much, but at the same time, not enough. Daniel wanted more, needed more. The room was filled with the sound of their heavy breathing, their moans, and the soft creaking of the bed as they moved together. Darren's hands never stopped exploring Daniel's body, teasing him, driving him closer and closer to the edge of ecstasy. Darren leaned in closer, his breath hot against Daniel's neck as he whispered, "I'm going to make you come harder than you ever have." And with that, he intensified his movements, each thrust deeper, each one more forceful than the last. Daniel's entire body tensed as the pleasure built inside him, growing stronger with every second. He could feel himself reaching the breaking point, his body responding instinctively to every move Darren made. And then, suddenly, the wave of pleasure crashed over him, taking his breath away as he cried out, his body trembling with the force of his release. Darren followed right behind him, his own moans filling the room as he reached his climax, their bodies moving in perfect sync as they both came together. The intensity of the moment left them breathless, their bodies shaking as they collapsed onto the bed, still clinging to each other as they tried to catch their breath. They lay there for a long time, their bodies tangled together, sweat cooling on their skin. Darren turned to face Daniel, a satisfied smile on his lips as he brushed a strand of hair away from his face. "You're incredible," he whispered, his voice low and full of admiration. But even as Daniel's body still buzzed from the intensity of what had just happened, a familiar doubt began to creep into his mind. How long could they keep doing this? The risk was getting greater with each passing day. His father still had no idea what was happening, but the longer they continued, the more dangerous it became. Darren, however, seemed completely at ease, as if the danger only added to the thrill. He pulled Daniel closer, their bodies fitting together perfectly, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to forget the risk. The warmth of Darren's arms around him, the lingering heat from their passion, it was enough to keep the doubts at bay, at least for now. But Daniel knew that sooner or later, they would have to face the reality of what they were doing, and when that time came, the consequences could be devastating. The days that followed were a mix of growing desire and a tension that Daniel could hardly control. Every time his father left for yet another trip, or disappeared for hours, Daniel and Darren seized every second of privacy to lose themselves in one another. The connection between them, once silent and filled with hesitation, had now become like a blazing fire, consuming them with every touch, every look. That afternoon, with the apartment once again empty, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Daniel knew what was coming, and the expectation made his skin tingle before Darren even got close. When he did, there was no gentleness. Darren pulled Daniel to him with possessive force, his hands already expertly unbuttoning Daniel's shirt with quick, precise movements. "I've been thinking about this all day," Darren murmured into Daniel's neck as his hand slid down the boy's back, tracing a path that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. Daniel could barely respond. His breath was already heavy, and he felt the heat spreading through his body with every touch. Clothes hit the floor quickly, and before he could even process what was happening, they were both naked, their bodies colliding in a way that made Daniel's heart race even faster. Darren pushed him against the bedroom wall, the impact making Daniel's pulse quicken even more. His hands gripped Daniel's hips tightly, holding him in place as their mouths met in a wild, hungry kiss. The pressure of Darren's body against his made every fiber of Daniel's being scream for more, and he knew Darren was ready to give him everything. Darren's mouth moved down Daniel's chest, his lips hot as they trailed over his skin, leaving Daniel trembling beneath his touch. Every kiss, every lick, was like an explosion of sensations, Daniel's body reacting to every move Darren made. His moans filled the room, muffled by the sound of their bodies moving together. Darren turned Daniel around, his hands sliding over his shoulders and down his waist, gripping him firmly as he leaned in, pressing his body against Daniel's from behind. Daniel bit his lip, his body already burning with anticipation. He was completely exposed, vulnerable, and it only heightened the desire he felt coursing through him. "You're going to love this," Darren murmured into his ear, his voice rough with desire. He positioned himself behind Daniel, his hands gripping his hips tightly as he began to move, slowly at first, teasing him with each thrust. The pressure of Darren's body against his was almost unbearable, every movement sending shockwaves of pleasure through Daniel's entire being. He could hardly breathe, his muscles tensing as Darren picked up the pace, his hands never leaving Daniel's hips, controlling every movement. Daniel moaned, his body trembling with every thrust, his hands braced against the wall as Darren drove him deeper into a world of pleasure he couldn't escape. Darren's rhythm was relentless, his hips slamming against Daniel's with a force that made him gasp for breath. It was all too much, but at the same time, not enough. Daniel wanted more, needed more. The room was filled with the sound of their heavy breathing, their moans, and the soft creaking of the bed as they moved together. Darren's hands never stopped exploring Daniel's body, teasing him, driving him closer and closer to the edge of ecstasy. Darren leaned in closer, his breath hot against Daniel's neck as he whispered, "I'm going to make you come harder than you ever have." And with that, he intensified his movements, each thrust deeper, each one more forceful than the last. Daniel's entire body tensed as the pleasure built inside him, growing stronger with every second. He could feel himself reaching the breaking point, his body responding instinctively to every move Darren made. And then, suddenly, the wave of pleasure crashed over him, taking his breath away as he cried out, his body trembling with the force of his release. Darren followed right behind him, his own moans filling the room as he reached his climax. Their bodies moving in perfect sync as they both came together. The intensity of the moment left them breathless, their bodies shaking as they collapsed onto the bed, still clinging to each other as they tried to catch their breath. They lay there for a long time, their bodies tangled together, sweat cooling on their skin. Darren turned to face Daniel, a satisfied smile on his lips as he brushed a strand of hair away from his face. "You're incredible," he whispered, his voice low and full of admiration. But even as Daniel's body still buzzed from the intensity of what had just happened, a familiar doubt began to creep into his mind. How long could they keep doing this? The risk was getting greater with each passing day. His father still had no idea what was happening, but the longer they continued, the more dangerous it became. Darren, however, seemed completely at ease, as if the danger only added to the thrill. He pulled Daniel closer, their bodies fitting together perfectly, and for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to forget the risk, the warmth of Darren's arms around him, the lingering heat from their passion. It was enough to keep the doubts at bay, at least for now. But Daniel knew that, sooner or later, they would have to face the reality of what they were doing. And when that time came, the consequences could be devastating. The tension between Darren and Daniel had reached its peak. Every stolen moment felt like it could be their last, and the thrill of secrecy only fueled their desire. That evening, Darren pulled Daniel close, their bodies colliding with a force that made everything else disappear. The heat between them was palpable as Darren pressed Daniel against the wall, his lips exploring every inch of Daniel's skin. Their movements were fast, desperate, and filled with raw passion. Darren's hands gripped Daniel's hips, his breath hot against Daniel's neck as he whispered promises that made Daniel's heart race. They lost themselves in the intensity of the moment, their bodies moving in sync, taking each other higher and higher, until they reached the point of no return. But as they collapsed together, breathless and satisfied, a familiar doubt crept into Daniel's mind. How much longer could they keep this up? The risk was growing every day, and deep down, he knew the consequences would catch up with them soon. The next morning, Daniel knew something had to change. As much as he wanted to stay in Darren's arms, the weight of reality was too heavy to ignore. He couldn't keep living in fear of being discovered, and the thought of his father finding out made his stomach twist. Darren woke up and immediately sensed the shift in Daniel. "We need to stop," Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Darren was silent, understanding the truth behind those words. There were no arguments, no promises of a future. They both knew the risks were too high, and as much as they didn't regret what had happened, it was time to end things before it all fell apart. As Daniel left the room, he knew that this chapter of his life had come to an end, but the memories would stay with him forever.